Consider the nature of a puppet, an artificial being made to purely realize the imagination of someone else, a master in the shadows, a figure crouched behind the curtain of the stage. Think of the strings that bind its arms and legs, its wrists and neck. Think of the humiliation of dancing at someone's behest, of moving as someone indicates. Think of a world that tells you you ought to act the fool and the powerless. Think of the quiet universe inside its wooden head. Welcome to Rebel Culture, where today we will explore a fascinating question in cinema, that being the role of free will and how a character can interact with a historical backdrop to remark the message of the movie. In 2022, two animated movies depicting adaptations of the same 1883 book by Carlo Collodi were being developed, both of them telling the story of a wooden puppet brought to life, about his childhood and his progress to learn the true meaning of what it means to be a real boy, an agent in a world that seeks to pull at their strings. I don't much care about the Disney remake. In our sister channel Rebel Economics, we have a video on what the point of all of these Disney remakes are. But today we will focus on the second movie to hit the screens based on Collodi's work. The movie, also called Pinocchio, is directed by Guillermo del Toro, one of the masters of realizing a heartfelt story with very dark underlying themes. Once I knew that Del Toro would be directing Pinocchio, I knew that we will experience a different take from the one Disney had etched in pop culture way back in 1940, when the original animated piece got released. Pinocchio is a story about many things. About a boy growing up and learning responsibilities, about the power of childhood to live incredible adventures, both fun and terrifying, and about the nature of the world around us. But what if I told you that Del Toro's Pinocchio is also about fascism and the necessity of disobedience to be able to challenge the status quo? Fascism is a political philosophy, movement or regime that exalts the nation and often raise above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. Fascism is a political philosophy that reached its high point of popularity across the European continent with the advent of the 20th century and the rise of authoritarian parties in Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, and Germany, led by Adolf Hitler. The genesis of the modern fascism, though, was very much Mussolini's idea, even if today it is related to other European dictators like Hitler due to his comparatively larger weight in threatening democracy in Europe, and Francisco Franco of Spain, due to him being the longest governing fascist. Mussolini can therefore largely be considered one of the architects of the modern interpretation of fascism, as the autocratic form of government that exalted nationalism and demanded absolute submission of the individual to the state. Pinocchio's original story was released in 1883, almost 50 years before the threat of fascism in Europe became an existential threat to many of the then few democracies on planet Earth. But Disney's reinterpretation of the classic book by Collodi reached screens in 1940, right as the first bullets of the Second World War began firing across the old continent. Obviously, since it is a children's movie, the impact of fascism in the story is not made explicit, especially since regardless of when it arrived in theaters, the story takes place in the 1800s when the book was written. But it would be disingenuous to assume that a story about a puppet learning to think for himself and thereby become a real boy set in a country ravaged by a threat to freedom is a parallelism that flew over the animators' heads. But what is clear is that there is one person from whom all of this parallelism didn't ring hollow. The name of this boy is Guillermo del Toro, and decades after seeing the original movie, he would go on and be given by Netflix the opportunity to direct his own adaptation. Del Toro has been very vocal about his desire to make a movie that retold the adventures of the wooden doll, but he did not simply want to make the story told in 1940s, but adapted to reflect the underlying conflicting messages of the story when considering the backdrop of Italy's painful years under the power of Mussolini. Del Toro's influences and ideas regarding fascism have been well documented across his filmography, with the director quite consistently referring to the mid-century calamities of World War II to ground his stories. This can be seen in the Pan's Labyrinth, taking place entirely during the Spanish Civil War, in which the democratic government of the Republic of Spain tried hopelessly to fight back the fascists. but also in his adaptations of the Hellboy comics, where a large amount of characters have direct relations with the events of the war. Guillermo del Toro seems to believe that the dark monsters of our stories, be them demons, monsters, or the deep and fairy people, must emerge out of the darkness of our real world, and that one needs not to turn to horror books and fireside stories to know the true darkness of the world. One must only open their eyes to our history. Del Toro's Pinocchio is unapologetically, undoubtedly, set during the interwar period in an Italy already under the heel of Mussolini's propaganda. Certain characters are markedly affected by the advent of this modern form of submission, as well as the traumatic events of the First World War, particularly the role of Geppetto, the woodmaker who designs Pinocchio and wishes for a replacement to his son that was killed during a bombing attack on the First World War. Pinocchio, like any child, is not entirely aware of the true darkness of the world around him, partially because he was born barely a week ago, but also because the eyes of children, while terribly perceptive, tend to focus on the small freedoms allowed to them. Playing in the street and having fun are liberties that even fascist states tend not to police too much when it comes to children. So from Pinocchio's eyes, the world is simply as open as it might have been otherwise. That is not to say that Pinocchio is a child that walks the line of responsibility perfectly. Pinocchio is a child that is fascinated by the world, and in wanting to explore it, makes mistakes and downright disobeys his father. In the traditional representation of this story, disobedience is seen as putting Pinocchio in more trouble than he would have otherwise had been, had he followed his father's advice. Most notoriously, this can be seen when the simple command of not talking to a stranger is not followed by Pinocchio and ends up being taken away by the fox, who tricks him into getting sent to Pleasure Island. Del Toro's version of the character walks the line between reinforcing the underlying message of the movie about the need to take responsibilities and mature to grow up, but also noting the dangers of blind obedience. In a recent interview, Del Toro mentioned that the brutal danger of fascism, beyond its perhaps unavoidable tendency towards armed conflict, is the way in which it puts the state and the dictator as a form of brutal paternalism that seeks to re-educate a population of grown men and women to believe that wrong things are right. It has been extensively proven that children are not born with a moral compass, but rather they inherit that from their parent, and virtue, more often than not, is learned by obedience. But the dangers of this human process of learning morality is that it can be very easily poisoned by the likes of Hitler, Franco, and Mussolini, who reframe moral in a way that adapts and conforms with their perspective to see the world. In Franco's Spain, an interesting effect took place, where people in small communities would alert the fascist police about crimes against the state committed by their neighbors, like bringing food to the mountains to feed the Republican army. You must understand that the people that those neighbors were essentially condemning to death by firing squad were very closely linked to them. They were not just a face in the street, they would have largely grown up together and known each other for their entire lives. The ways in which the fascist government rewrote morality and brutally castigated dissent led to a reframing of the concepts of right and wrong, and made obedience a virtue for adults, just like it is so often for children. So, this ghostly, corrosive, paternal power of fascist states in the movie therefore compromises an advice that many modern parenting democracies easily extend to their children. Shut up and obey. Do what I say. Because now, since their moral compasses have been corrupted by the state, their commanding the kids to be obedient of their desires serves as a perpetuation of those broken values. Under this light, Pinocchio stands as a sort of messiah figure, who can make use of his innocence to question the status quo as a person unperturbed by the mutated morality that was necessary to survive under the tyrants of the 20th century. We are therefore presented with a beautiful paradox, in which, in a world that demands subjugation of the citizens, disobedience is made a virtue, because under fascism, everyone is tied up in strings of fear, and the only one who can think freely is the puppet. Thank you for watching Rebel Culture. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. We have lots of videos that you might be interested in, so go check them out. That was all from our part, and I will see you in the next one.